So for this session, we're very lucky to have my colleague, Jason Quinn from the Peace Accord Matrix. Hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about that. Jason, thank you for being here.
Thanks for coming. I'm happy today to introduce Hector Silva Avalos. He has 20 years experience as a journalist, editor, and a writer. He's worked in El Salvador as a reporter and editor for several magazines and for magazines in Guatemala. And in 2014, he founded an online magazine, Factum. Mr. Avalos is a senior research fellow at the Center for Latin American Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of UCA in El Salvador, has an MA in journalism from University of Barcelona, Spain. He also attended Columbia University. Mr. Avalos has been a contributor to Insight Crime, which we use quite a bit as a source at PAM and also in our work monitoring the implementation of the Columbia Peace Accord. Mr. Avalos today is going to talk about some of the field work that he's done for many years on transnational criminal capacity, mostly MS-13 in the U.S. and El Salvador. Today's talk is about the attempted truce with MS-13 during the period of 2011-2013. What happened, how did that unfold, and what are the chances for a truce in the future?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. As I was telling her now, it's always good to come to the United States and to these venues and talk about what's happening in their countries, because of course, driving forces from civil society, from universities in the United States are always important to have U.S. politicians and U.S. Policymakers understand, aside from the mainstream narrative of Washington, D.C., what's happening in this part of the world, in my part of the world. I've had luck. Well, journalism I'm a journalist by training. But for a little while, I was also a diplomat at the service of my country in Washington, D.C. Back in 2009. And that gave me the opportunity to know about these issues and about how the U.S. approaches these issues from the ground in DC, and it was really, really enriching to learn that. Not always good, but I happened to be in DC. I lived in one of DC suburbs for 9 years, and I happened to be there when the Truce unraveled, the gang Truce unraveled in El Salvador. And because of my work, I had the chance to actually learn about the Truce from the political side of it, from how it was engineered within the Salvadoran government, how it was approached by the Obama administration back in those days, and how it existed in the ground. And that was the most important part, how this affected in good ways and bad ways the communities that are controlled by the gangs in El Salvador. And first of all, I think this is the most important gang, the phenomenon. This is that how try to deal with the phenomenon. It's important to understand how gangs are a main part of the social fabric in El Salvador, especially in the communities of the poor. Those communities right now, after 30 years, those communities are not to be understood without understanding the gangs. That's really important because when you think of policy, the gang is a part of the community. If your policy is to kill the gang, your policy must be also kill the community. It is what it is. It is how it is. It is like that in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, some parts of Mexico. But it's also like that in the United States. In some counties, in suburban New York, in suburban Washington, D.C., suburban Houston, suburban LA, it's the same. If your policy is to criminalize and deport the gang, well, your policy will always be to criminalize and deport the Latino communities in which the gang exists. So I've been thinking and researching about that for a while, but also, and you know, journalism has brought me to a number of places, and a lot of them, when you report from the ground in the Northern Triangle of Central America, most of those places are dark because it is a very violent part of the world, as you know. And unfortunately, it is a part of the world in which hopelessness is a way of living for a lot of poor people, especially for poor people. But also journalism has brought me to very enlightened places. And because I've got to cover from journalism, from the perspective of journalism, the lives of really extraordinary people. One of those being Monsignor Romero. I had the opportunity of covering the final stages of the canonization process since 2015, when Pope Francis and Monsignor Barrio, sí, el postulador, I don't know, yeah, of the cause, talked first and for the first time kind of freely about the process. I got to go to Rome and interview him, and I learned a lot about the process, about the church, about the Vatican, and about, again, the country, and how at the center of all this obscurity was this figure of a man who was always during his life, and then after his death, at the center of these communities, the very same communities, the very same people that we're talking about right now. So now when they wrote me from Notre Dame saying if I wanted to talk about this, and of course, I think it brings, it makes all sense in the world to talk about this. Because at the center of this whole problem, and this is the key point I want to make, is the same poor Salvadorans that are always the victims, you know, of violence, of ill policies, of really extractive, selfish oligarchs. It's the same people, the same kind of victims, the same places. The same places, when you see the pictures of Monsignor Romero in life, the same places, the same communities that he went to, well, the very same places are now coexisting with the gang. So we're talking about the same thing. They asked me to talk about the truth, how that unraveled, how that happened, and whether that's a possibility right now. And sometimes, you know, talking to people that knows about that gives you kind of the opening line to what you want to say. That happened to me a couple of days ago when we were traveling with Arnau on the same plane, and we were talking about this, and Arnau said this: the truth was never a dialogue. It was always a negotiation. Those are different things, right? It was a negotiation between one leadership, that of the gang, and other leadership, that of the administration of President Mauricio Funes back in 2012, 2011, I think it started. So that had political implications. That gave some results at the political level. But since it was never a dialogue, because both parts, but especially the government of Mauricio Funes, didn't acknowledge that as a policy of dialogue. That's crippled the initiative from the beginning. So let me tell you what I know of how this started by, as I said, knowing a little bit about it from when I was a public official in the Salvadoran embassy in Washington, D.C., and then the unraveling of it as a journalist, covering it, or as a researcher for American University, talking to people, learning from people like Jose Martinez, who you heard yesterday, and who I think is one of the Salvadoran professionals that knows most about this, because he has talked to the people. A lot of journalists, we have talked to the leadership, the politicians or the gang. That's sexy, right? Talking to the guys in jail, Diablito, Sierra, Viejolín, all these guys. But there's very few of us that have talked to the people in the communities. And one is one of those. So I'm really glad that he said what he had to say yesterday. Well, first of all, whose idea was this of breaking a truce with the gangs? I think this back in 2009, even 2009, when Mauricio Funes became president under the flag of the FMLN, the former guerrilla that was then a party, a political party after the peace accord. The idea and some forms of truces had existed at the local levels, and when researching about this and talking to police officers, veteran police officers, or majors in some communities in the country, they told me, listen, this is not new, because talking to gangs is part of daily living in these communities. You cannot exercise power, political power at the local level if you don't talk to them. You cannot exercise some public functions if you don't talk to them. Why? Well, because they do exercise territorial control over these places. Communities, neighborhoods, towns, they're a factual power. So we had majors, again, or police officers telling us this, or community leaders, churches, telling us, politicians, they said, well, if you want to campaign in these places, you gotta talk to them. You must talk to them, because they provide security. They provide the guarantee that no one's gonna be harmed. But that is not provided by the police or by the state. It's provided by the gang. They perform some public duties, let's say, as being intermediaries even in family problems. One told me this story about a guy, a clique leader in a community. I remember in Mexicano was this, in which a woman came to the gang leader and said, "My husband is hitting me," and the gang leader called the guy and said, "Listen, you cannot do this here. If you keep doing that, you will face us." So they're an authority. So talking to them was daily practice in a lot of communities. So that, my understanding is that the Funes administration and some of its nearest collaborators in the beginning of the Funes administration came to power thinking that was a good idea. And some attempts were even made to start talking to gang leadership from the beginning. But then something happened that kind of tackled all of that. Well, and that happened very quietly, because this, of course, was a political bomb that the government didn't know how to deal with. Because, not just because it was unpopular, for the reasons that were stated here before, because, there's a circle of violence in which gangs and gang leadership are the bad guy, and they are in a lot of situations, in a lot of communities, but because also, and this is not often talked about, one of the pillars of government in El Salvador is still the legal use of force by those institutions authorized to do that, by the Constitution, the police and the army. And this is a new government coming from the left that had to deal. This is the old foe, right? This is the old enemy. That now is the president of that part, the president coming from that party, the former guerrilla, is now commander-in-chief. So the political play with the army is not, it wasn't easy. So the Funes administration knew that they had to deal with that. And nonetheless, there were leaders, very respectful people, thinking about this. Okay, how do we address this? Mano dura was not as far as I understand it, a pillar policy in the Funes administration at the beginning. That was not the way they were thinking of dealing with the problem. They were open. They were open to some ideas, to some daring new ideas, and they started trying to put things together. But then something happened. I don't know. I don't have enough information whether to say that was a form of the gang, that something that the gang did to push negotiations. I don't know that. But the fact is that in 2010, el Buda Mexicano, right? In 2010, Barrio 18, one faction of Barrio 18, lit a minibus of the public transport and burned 17 people in the inside. So any idea that the Funes administration had on talking was tackled like that, and then the same old forces from the La Fuerza Pública, from the public force, put a word out to the president and say, listen, see, you cannot deal with that. So that kind of tackled the process, which again was very incipient. And then another thing happened that had to do with the president himself. He kind of got away from that hopeful beginning and started turning himself to the traditional political powers, whether those were some forms of the political right, people around the former president, the last Arena president, who's now in jail for corruption, some a part of the military. And the US had a lot to do with that. The Obama administration pushed very hard, the Funes administration, for the Funes administration to get rid of the security cabinet, members of the security cabinet that the Funes administration had named. All of those, the Minister of Justice and Security, the head of the State Intelligence Organization, the head of the National Civilian Police had something in common in the first half of the Funes administration. They were all former guerrilla members. The US didn't like that. The Obama administration didn't like that. The word that they put out was that one of those guys was accused by the CIA back in 1984 of being part of the guerrilla commander that killed US Marines in East and South. The US never proved that. But they pushed with that argument the Funes administration to get rid of that, of him and then other members of cabinet. The way I understand that is that US agencies in the ground in El Salvador were very nervous because for the first time in years, they didn't actually control. I mean, maybe control is a tough word, but influence, had the good influence, which means here's what we want you to do. For the first time, they didn't know what the police was thinking. Not even what the army was thinking. What the intel agencies were thinking, the Salvadoran intel agencies were thinking. So it was unnerving to them. So a lot of things that the State Department heard from El Salvador was, these are not our traditional allies. And that's not good. So The Obama administration pushed hard again, and I remember back in 2011, I think it was March, after President Obama actually came down to El Salvador to visit San Salvador and went to the Bishop Romero's grave. Afterwards, his deputy assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere, Julissa Reynoso, under the Clinton administration in the State Department, went to El Salvador. Both countries were negotiating a second compact of what's called the Millennium Cooperation Challenge, which is basically a pack of aid that's just set and given to countries in order to develop, to do focal development in areas of the country. The first compact was in the north of the country. The second compact, which was finally approved, was for the southern part, the coastal shore. But Ms. Reynoso came down to El Salvador and met with a number of officials and said, listen, one unofficial and friendly request here is that you get rid of his case. And that gave other forces within the military in El Salvador a golden opportunity to step in and be in power. So in November 2011, the military came back to control the security apparatus of El Salvador. Some people more friendly in the analysis to that decision of the president would say, well, it's not the same military that's the one that fought the war. Maybe so. But we know now that it was a pretty corrupt military as the one that we knew during the war. But the head, the key guy here is General David Munguia Paez, who is now who kept being the minister. He was named the Minister of Security and Justice. And then his naming was ruled unconstitutional because he is military, and the peace accord establishes that the security apparatus cannot be headed by a military official. But the point is that he brought all his people with him. He named a general as head of the police. He named a colonel head of the state intelligence for a while, and so for the first time since the end of the war, the military controlled all intelligence and security apparatus in the country. General Munguia, though, had a group of advisors. Amongst them was Raul Mijango, a former guerrilla commander that, along with others, had this idea and gave the idea and brought the idea to the general and said, listen, the only way to deal with the gang problem is talking to them. And I do have some ways to get into the leadership. And start talking. And that's how it started. And what happened was that it was set, the blueprint was again a negotiation. I truly believe that some people involved in that had really good intentions of making this, of getting to the point in which they could afford to make this policy, state policy, a dialogue, not a negotiation, but it is how it started. And the bargaining terms were pretty simple. We engaged you leaders of the gang in prison. We give you the means to communicate with your ranks in the streets or facilitate that in order for you to talk to them and have them diminish violence. Have them not use violence as the only argument for everything. In exchange for that, and there was a lot of myths around this. What I learned is that in exchange, and there was a lot of myths and that they received money, millions of dollars, that they received, luxury conditions in the jail. I don't know if some of you have visited the jails in El Salvador. That's impossible I mean, there's no way. I mean, we were talking yesterday about Guatemalan jails controlled by narcos. Yes, there's some kinds of luxury. There's none whatsoever in Salvadoran jails. None. Luxury probably is not sleeping in a place like this with 500 guys. That might be luxury. The thing is that at the end of the day, they engaged leadership and of the gang leadership, engaged with the leadership in the streets, and it was like, okay, conditions where leadership is going to be transferred from the maximum security prisons to other more relaxed jails. They will have means of communications with the outside world. They always had them, but this was going to be official. So the jail system became the center point of this. And the other part was the police force is going to relax the way it treats the guys in the street. And that allowed for a bargaining. What happened in the communities were yet understanding that. But in those years, and this is already 2012, what happened, it was unequivocal in terms of violence. The homicide numbers diminished by half, for 6+ months. That was real. Okay, so, wow, I didn't, now, as government, you have the poisonous fruit became a more eatable fruit, right? So you can now present this. Well, no, because again, we're still learning, but one reason I think is was Roberto and Arnau said before. If you're killing poor people, and all of a sudden you're killing half of them, the people in the upper echelons is the same. Oh, well, they're killing each other less than before, but what does that have to do with me? Me that I'm part of the elites, I'm part of the privileged ones. That's one thing. It kept, then what Father Gabriel said is the circle diminishing homicide by half didn't stop the circle. There were vengeances that were just postponed. Juan explained this to me too. It was like, by talking to clique leaders, was like, okay, what the guy in the street, how did the guy in the street implemented what he was hearing from the jail? Well, the word from the jail, you gotta stop killing, right? You need to use other arguments. So the word back from the street, what are you talking about? The thing that I've done to discipline these guys, to have the word of the Mara be respected, is killing. So now what do I do? And they implemented some alternative mechanism of discipline with the circles of vengeance. The endless circle was not broken at all. Because they reduced half of the killing, but they still killed that half. So that circle was never tackled. And then the other part of this is that the government, Mauricio Funes, back in 2013, when the moment became, okay, now we have managed to reduce the homicides, how do we make this sustainable? Bargaining with the leadership was not enough in order to make this sustainable, because in order to tackle the circle, in order to tackle territorial control, you cannot do that from the jails. You need to do that from the ground. And you cannot do that with the argument of the police only. You need to do that with the argument of the state, the entire state. You need to start intervening in schools. You need to start giving some hope to these young people. Again, the truth never went to the core reasons of the existence of the gang in the first place, which is hopelessness, which is the lack of any other opportunity of surviving. If you live there, you either become one of them, you get killed, or you leave. You just leave. And in order to tackle that, in order to get rid of those conditions, you need a state. Well, the administration wasn't strong enough, and the leadership of President Funes wasn't strong enough to go there. And then elections were coming. All right? So the political establishment went back to point zero, which is, yeah, we talk with these guys in order for them to allow us to campaign. We promised these guys stuff. And the FMLN, looking forward to 2014, to the next presidential election, did that. From the state, they promised things. You know, they promised money to some gang leaders saying, okay, we can give you $10 million in the form of social programs if you help us win. The current mayor of San Salvador, who is from the Arena Party, and one of the most visible leaders of the Arena Party now, also talked to them. They were recorded by the gangs, you know, and saying, yeah, offering money. But this was, again, a bargain, a negotiation, not a dialogue, right? And some say, I don't have enough, again, research to say this was true. But some, even within the FMLN and the Funes administration, said that that negotiation helped the current president win. Gave the current president a number of votes. Again, this is a important social organization that has a criminal component, a violent component, but it is a social organization embedded in the community. They vote, they have families, they represent people, so they have the power to bargain. And the FMLN won. My understanding is that there was, again, a very shy, timid dialogue, talking attempt, but that was tackled pretty soon, and the hardcore part of the FMLN retook the leadership of the National Civilian Police and the leadership of the Minister of Security. And the policy line was no. We're gonna leave all this nonsense aside of talking to these guys because we're at war. And the way to address this is, as we do it in the war, as we did it in the war. You hit them before they hit us. And that became the motto, right? And that's where we are now. From 2014 on, in 2015 was the most violent year in recent history in terms of homicides. And the gang responded. Of course they responded. They were a new gang now. They learned things. Yeah, we have the power to interact with these guys. You know, we now know that we can use violence as a political argument. So if they're hitting us, well, let's hit back. Not in a more sophisticated way, because now we're going to target them policemen, them soldiers. And they started doing that. And we got back to those words of Monsignor Romero. The poor hitting the poor. The soldiers and police agents live in the same places. So yeah, it was a war amongst the poor. And that escalated. And the state responded with this policy of tierra arrasada. Scorched earth. It's a war. And police officers, police ranks, army ranks were given the liberty to act, to fire well. So now, we fast forward to today, and what we have is a state in which the communities that have lived with the gang, embedded within those communities, now have to confront that violence, the violence of the gang, which they have to learn to live with, and that exacerbated violence of the state, in which again young men, especially young men, are the target, are criminalized. You're as one of the most famous poets put it, you are always going to be suspicious just because you're male and you're Salvadoran. And because you live here, not there, right? And so the violence of the state became public policy. And that's how this administration has addressed that. And that's one of the, so now we have a new president-elect. I don't know if you guys from El Salvador know what he's about. I don't. I don't know what his policies, his platform is, because one day he is, the most revolutionary of guys, and the next day he's at the Heritage Foundation, praising the pillars of neoliberalism and the Trump administration. So I really don't know what. In terms, and we have been discussing this with Salvadoran colleagues for a while, and what is he going to do with security? What is he going to do about the gang problem? He was mayor of El Salvador, quite successful one in terms of, he did some things. In order to do some of those things, and not coincidentally, I think, when the celebration of the beatification of Monsignor was done, he was the mayor. And in order to allow for the city to hold that, which was a celebration, he had to talk to the gangs. He had to talk to gang leadership in the center, in downtown San Salvador and surroundings, and said, listen, a lot of people is coming to this place, and we're celebrating this, so behave. And they said, okay, yes, let's talk. So he knows, his people knows how it's done, right? But now he hasn't named his transition team, nor has given us hints of what his cabinet is going to look like. There are words out, words formed from some people that advised him or was close to him during the campaign. But all sorts of people were close to him. Human rights defenders, well-respected human rights defenders were around him, but also very well-known hardcore police officers were around him and helped him structure his what's supposed to be his public security agenda. And when you hear some of those names, you say, oof, nothing's going to change. It could even get worse, but we don't know. So just to finish and conclude this, I will conclude with two ideas. One is this possible to replicate? I don't know. Even the negotiation that happened in 2011, 2012, we don't know who the leadership of MS-13 is. Leadership in jail is really diminished because part of that violence of the state was really hitting them hard in the jails, confining them to maximum security reclusion. A lot of them seeing the light of day one hour a day. So you cannot engage those guys because they don't have leadership anymore. Who's the leadership now in the streets? It's losing. There's young guys saying, what? They tricked us once. So we're not for that anymore. And you know what? The only way that I have here to rule, to exercise power is the same way that we always know, which is violence. So I don't know if that's possible to replicate. Even what we saw in 2012, 2011, 2012. I do hope that this guy, with all the boldness that, the daring postulates that all his millennial carelessness, let's say, that brought him to power, that he put that to good use. And actually, he ends being bold in this. Because I do understand this. There is no way whatsoever to address this problem without engaging that part of the problem into the conversation. Not killing that part of the problem, that doesn't work. Because in the way, you kill entire communities, and in the way, you make the state become a criminal actor, another gang, with the license to kill. And just to finish, I wouldn't dare saying anything about what would Monsignor Romero would have said in this scenario. If Roberto Cuellar doesn't dare to say that, but I know this. What I know of Monsignor Romero, I knew from my family, my grandfather, my father, my mother. They were all his followers in life. They went to the masses, they heard him, and so on. I didn't hear him. Then I heard the recordings of his homilies, read his word, and as I said, when I began, I was able to assist to the last stages of his canonization. But let me finish with a scene I saw the 13th of October of last year, the night before in the surroundings of St. Peter's Square, the night before he was officially acknowledged as a saint by the Catholic Church. I saw thousands of Salvadorans from all parts of Europe, from the US, mainly migrants. And they were those Salvadorans to which Monsignor Romero devoted his life and his work. Poor people, marginalized people, migrants in Milan, in London, in the US, United States. And they were there in search of hope. I guess the importance of Monsignor Romero's word is that I guess he would have put himself as the voice of those same people that now are migrants, that are marginalized, criminalized in this country, by this government, this country, or in El Salvador. I like to think that he would become a very fervent defender of migrants in these days. As I told you guys, I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, very close to Maryland, which is kind of the HQ of MS-13 in Maryland. And yeah, those are Monsignor Romero's people. The ones that don't have voice, that now live in the shadows because the president of this country criminalizes them as part of his main political narrative. And a lot of people that are coming, that will keep coming, because those conditions that the Truce wasn't able to address are still there. Yeah, that's what I think. It's the kind of the idea that interests. That's.
I would like to get your views with respect to the diminishment of killings during the truce. Some people say that in fact, the diminishment was just simply a transformation, that the police allow the gangs to participate in other illegal activities without much interference, and that the killings that appear on the streets are now underneath the ground, and these are the killings went down substantially, but these disappearances went up substantially.
Two things about that. First, I do think that as I said, Father, when what I've learned by studying, criminal economies and criminal actors in El Salvador, I think it's accurate to say that gangs have served as the muscle for more powerful organizations like narcotraficantes, right? There's all this narrative, both in the Northern Triangle and here in the United States, about how MS-13 is supposed to be this huge cartel. That's not true. But cliques in El Salvador, in Honduras, have served as muscle. And I heard that during the truce in Soyapango, there was a openness to petty drug dealing with the knowledge of the police, and some police officers benefiting from it. In terms of that dichotomy that includes killings, the diminishing of killings and the increase of disappearances, from what I've read, from the numbers I've seen, I think it happened at a certain degree. I think there were more disappearances, but not in a way you can equate all things. Like same amount of people were killed, but the half that we don't see now in the homicide figures are underground. I think that's my view is that was an exaggeration. That's what I think.
Hi, I'm Rosa. I'm a master in development management, and I would like to ask you. You have said, why do you think? I understand the El Salvador state could be a weak state, but why do you think this problem is not at the roots of the problem? Wait a minute. So I think to tackle the root problems, you need to work not only the state and the guns, you need to involve society. So you need all the stakeholders need to be there. The church, all the political parties, doesn't matter if it's the Frente, if it's Arena. So all really need to be there, and I think this is very difficult. But you have also mentioned that they are killing good people. It's basically gang members that are good people and police officers that are good people. So the reason for not tackling this problem is because the state can't do it, or because they don't want to. Because it is just poor people, and who cares?
Well, I think, yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, listen, I think there are two lines of reasoning here. One is that, yeah, it's not enough to say it's a weak state. Well, the Guatemalan is a weak state too, and they have done other type of things, which have produced better results in the same kind of communities as in El Salvador. And conditions are pretty similar, Some experiences here in the US have, there's always US academia or US stakeholders asking Central Americans, what's the way to deal with this? My answer is always, look at your communities, Look at some counties. Montgomery County, Maryland, Fairfax County, Virginia, LA County at some point, they have come with models that yes, require money, but what they require, first of all, is will, you know, a will that extends to the police forces, right? And that you don't buy with money, you know, so the political will hasn't been there in Central America. For those two reasons, basically, because, you know, who cares, right? They're killing each other, that's the line. They're killing each other. And secondly, and this I think is important, because gangs, communities, criminalized communities and gangs are the perfect and have been the perfect scapegoat for the political elites. You know, it's the same play script that repeats itself over and over and over again. In the mid-2000s, I heard then President Ricardo Maduro of Honduras, who's now also charged for corruption and all that, in Miami, in a conference saying, I used the gang issue because the gang issue was the one that got me elected. Listen to the Guatemalan authorities, you know, President Jimmy Morales circled by corruption accusations. His officials circled by corruption accusations. What's their line now? Let's get the gangs. Those are the bad guys. So if they have been, well, the United States of America, bad hombres, gangs, they're the perfect scapegoat. So the political elites, why they will be willing to erase that poster child of evil if it's so useful in political time, right? Sorry if I'm being so cynic, but that's what I've learned from the political elites in my country and here, right?
Homicides have gone down in Salvador in the last 2 or 3 years, right? What would be your explanation of that reduction? First, and second, related to that, and it's not only for you, but also by our human rights specialists here. One of the problems with that reduction is that the government is saying, look, you know, our strategy is working, right? We have reduced homicides consistently in the last 3 years, right? So the hitting hard gangs. So what would be your response?
I would ask you that. Listen, I think there's a combination. First of all, I think sadly, the killing policy is a paradox. The killing policy has been effective to diminish killing because the state has been so harsh on the communities and so harsh on the gang that I think it has diminished the firepower of the gang. That's one thing. The other thing is that, and this is the key thing, if before violence was more chaotic before the truce, because it was the argument for everything, now the fact is that the violence is being exercised, I would say, in the same degree by the state. And the killings of the state are more selective. You know, the state goes and kills. You know, they target someone, they target that clique leader, they target that sospechoso, and if they need to kill a couple more, they'll do it. You know, so again, I don't want to sound cynic, but I think the state violence is more efficient in that regard, more effective, more selective, you know. Of course, because they are protected by impunity. police agents at the end, police officials, police agents, military personnel is protected by impunity. I now said it. 2 convictions, two. And it's these kind of cases in which, it's like they're there, it's like, oh no, it was a confrontation. Listen, the guy has 2 shots here. And no, but it was like that. So that's something, that I say that the state, the political forces within the state have a plan, and the plan is the engine of that plan is the political line, is we have been effective, right? We have brought down the numbers, and there's no other way to do it than this, right? So El Salvador shares and gives that line of reasoning and that policy gets the clapping, right? But again, in the way, now you have a criminal police. Communities that live in constant fear, now like sandwiched in between the traditional violence of the gang and the state. But again, this is my, I don't have hardcore data to say. I'm expecting your studies in order to support this.
Concerning your question, or better more than me, but the current homicide rate is higher than the average of the homicide rate since 2000. The problem is, I think, is if we compare this homicide rate in terms of 2015, because it was the highest in the history of El Salvador. So it doesn't make sense saying that the current political is effective, because it was the worst year in 2015. So I think that this point, and the second one concerning the father's questions on the disappearances. In El Salvador, we don't have, I don't know how to say, un método cuantitativo to check whether it's true it's a forced disappearance or not. So saying that with Barrio, it was a problem because it get higher the forced disappearance. There's no scientific method to say that. So I think that is very important. Otherwise, they are trying to lie. But it's our point of view.
So this is all very interesting, and I wanted to run a theory past you and see what you think about it. But one of the issues about the accounting, and of course we know that crime is deeply political. It's used by everyone to justify how good they're doing or how bad their opponent is doing, and so on. But with the reduction in crime, we're always talking about it as a global reduction or a national reduction. But it seems like the FARO had some really interesting work that didn't get a lot of attention about how uneven the reduction in homicide rates was. That there were some municipalities that saw an enormous reduction, and that those reductions seemed to be more stable afterward. And it seemed to be, it was in certain communities that took the truce where a mayor and a police chief took the truce as an opportunity to take a new direction. And they did local negotiation or dialogue about, okay, what are we gonna do with the guys? If you want us to stop extorting, what kind of programs, reinsertion programs we have. And some mayors were willing to sit down and talk. And there were a number of articles about communities where this was a high level thing, and churches and pastors were often involved, or a priest or somebody, to sort of give this enough public blessing. But it seemed like what the truce did was it gave cover to a number of municipal leaders who wanted to try something different. And then when that window of opportunity closed, it really got difficult again. So that, yes, it helped that Viejo and whoever was doing these kinds of negotiations, but it was just as important that talks could happen at the local level because there was some political space for it. Does that?
Yeah, I think it's complex. I think it's complex, and I think it is uneven, as you said. I think there were different experiences, majors and local players that understood that it had created a political space. You know, the problem was that it all crashed, you know, and the political space closed. And it was closed by the political leadership that those politicians had to respond to. Then you have the case of the mayor of Ilopango, Salvador, who's now dead. But he was one of the ones. The guy is complex too. But
How decent.
but he was one of. Okay, let's talk about another guy, Oscar Ortiz, the current vice president. You know, he had conversations. Santa Tecla, before the truce, experienced a reduction, right? Of course, Oscar Ortiz was one of the main guys in the party, blah, 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 and he had more a wider political umbrella, right? But then the whole thing became about word, you know, and those opportunities and those spaces were closed when it all came crashing down, you know, and that's the irony of it. And I take what you're saying to reinforce something I said is the second part of this was the part in which the negotiation could have become a dialogue. But for that, you needed political will, and Funes didn't have the leadership at that stage of his presidency for a number of reasons, including himself. And you needed the will, and you needed especially the will to put the state at the service of that, regardless of the electoral consequences of it, right? Of course, now you could say, well, if you could have transformed this, taken a couple of municipalities and you know, important municipalities as Ilopango, Soyapango, and have moved forward with this with more resources. But then again, politics became involved, and you know, you wouldn't, if you were the FMLN, why would you want to benefit the Arena guy in Ilopango? You know, and so it was an opportunity. I agree with that. It was that showed results. You know, again, factual results, especially in some municipalities. I would say that even now, some of those municipalities are less violent, but it never became policy.
Yeah, the political will could be there, you know, at the top, but that doesn't mean that even though the political will is there, that they have the capacity to deliver on the reform, right, within the you know, bureaucracies and institutions.
No, and that's a good point, because in order to bring the state to these communities, well, Monsignor Romero was talking about education. You know, education is the infrastructure. I mean, again, if you look at what's of these models here, one of the places to which a lot of resources go in these counties is the education system. You know, the school, the prevention part. And that's, again, that never the Salvadoran state, neither at the local level or at the national level, has devoted enough to that. And then again, you know, there are important, well, we have players, key players of this here, that we're hearing from, you know, important non-state players as churches that have found a way to bring some hope to young people. But that's not the state. And to solve this, you need the state.
I mean, especially as, I mean, what I see, what we see a lot in the Civil War negotiations is I mean, you know, to simplify things, I mean, in discussions and academic treatments, I mean, the state, you know, is often treated as a unitary actor the same way with the opposition group. But I mean, what we see is that even when there's a high amount of political will and commitment at the top, you know, I mean, governments are Janus-based organizations divided.
Yeah.
And I mean, from a rebel's point of view or from an oppositional point of view, I mean, it's not enough to have even the high political will at the top. I mean, you have to demonstrate that you're able to overcome the principal agent problems that really, that's what prevents any type of, you know, that's why it's so system. That's the fundamental problem in my view, why systems can't reform. It's, you know, principal agent problem goes, you know, it's just diffused throughout. You know, those that can, you know, those individuals that benefit from the status quo policy, are the ones that are going to have to implement the reform. They're, you know, they control that little fiefdom.
Yeah. No, that's a fact. Of course it is.
I have this thing in my heart that I need to say right now, and it's this idea of the gang being the problem, and gang members being the ones that need to be fixed. And I just think, because of a lot of the things that I've heard throughout the day, is this idea that when we give people, especially during the truce, we gave the guys a microphone to be able to speak, but we never thought about the community. And you said it very well, they are community. So to think about this problem, we need to stop thinking of them as a disease and actually think of them as community. And how do we start changing that community? Because it's about culture, because it's about state, because it's about relationships. It's about how do we create a different path for the society? And that includes them, definitely, but it includes the rest of the people too. And that means that we're gonna have to do really hard things, because there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of terrible things that are happening now, that happened in the past. So we shouldn't be surprised of what we have. And what should be happening is learning from what we didn't do during the war. The peace agreements, lovely, but you just said something about the truce that we have been repeating about the peace agreements. It didn't go to the bottom of the problem. The problem is still there, and we still look at the symptoms as how we need to give them as a camino fe, when we really need to treat what's going on inside. So, you know, this idea of just leveling up the terrain for everybody to actually have a dialogue, it's going to hurt, and we need to think about that too.
I agree completely. And again, I think at the, you know, underneath what you're saying is, I think the illness is the lack of hope. You know, a society that doesn't provide the minimum network for its youngsters to have the sense of hope, as you know, we expect to our own children. I mean, in order to do that, I mean, it's about reconstructing the entire fabric of society, which is, and you begin in the family. You know, and it's, if families have been, you know, destroyed by violence way before the gangs even existed, it's it's gonna hurt. Yeah.
Just to add to desperation, when the budget for education comes out, it's usually a percentage of the prior budget. That's wrong. It should be a percentage of GNP, because the richness of the country has grown, and the percentage that the prior government, the prior budget represents is small. Therefore, it will take us 15 years or more, billions of dollars to introduce education as a form of
Yes. And I think that has to do with what you were saying. I mean, if you want to put it, I mean, I'm convinced that all this reconstruction of the social tissue doesn't exist without the state. And in order to have the state there, you need resources. And in these countries, that's the core problem of a lot of things. You know, these are broken financially. These are broken states because because that agent that you refer to in our case is the rich, the ruling elite, doesn't care. And those are, I think, Roberto Miguel used the formula yesterday. These are extractive elites, you know. They extract from the country the resources, including the people. So education is not, the education of society is not a priority.
Yeah, I just think that, I mean, I'm really glad that I heard your talk today. I mean, there were so many things that you said that really gave me some insights about, I mean, I studied Civil War peace agreements and peace agreement implementation. And, you know, academics, I mean, in order to study something, you have to put a boundary around it. But I mean, at least for people in my field, they don't want to go anywhere near the criminal gangs, right? We want to look at political rebel movements, and we like to think of these things as a solid concept, and that's something different, right? But, you know, hearing him talk today, I mean, you realize that, I mean, you know, I mean, the way to approach these things is to really use the same type of national and international models that, you know, that we do with large nationwide peace processes, which center around, you know, comprehensive negotiated. So, I mean, I just see that as, I mean, if you think about it in a Civil War context, I mean, you were talking about the obstacles of why the truce didn't work. I mean, there's never been a Civil War a comprehensive peace agreement negotiated where the leaders weren't given amnesty, released from prison, right? So that's just a necessary condition. It's never happened before, really, you know. So how would that happen with this group, you know, with a group like that? I mean, that's, you know, it's always been a necessary condition. It's going to be a necessary condition here. And, you know, the same thing, you know, we need to negotiate a ceasefire. I mean, we could just go step by step. I mean, these are the things that would need to be put in place, you know, to reach some type of settlement. And then again, I mean, in you know, just in a historical context, I mean, when a state, I mean, at least I've studied, I mean, when a state negotiates a series of agreements with different groups and they don't work and they're not implemented, the number of groups in the country just continues to get bigger. The problem continues to get bigger, right? And I mean, it's a very slow process of trying to rebuild. I mean, really, it's a signal. I mean, you have no capacity, you have no incentive to negotiate an agreement with the government when you know that it needs to be implemented, right? So really, I mean, the turning point that I've seen in a lot of situations is, I mean, the government's got to take the first step and actually prove capacity to implement. And then after that, I mean, you know, you can reach a series of piecemeal agreements. And I mean, with each one, you prove a little bit more capacity to reform. But, you know, I mean, at least in a Civil War context, I mean, military-centric, you know, policies, you know, I mean, I was very uncertain about this, very skeptical about this, but it's not, you know, in my field, I mean, we've studied this, and I mean, the military-centric policies just do not work in the long term at the national level. People don't understand the level of analysis problem. I mean, military solutions to one group can be very effective. You eliminate that group and that group will not come back, but what the models overlook, what people overlook is that 4 or 5 more groups will pop up. And it's a never-ending cycle. I mean, it's actually, I mean, I've actually found that military victories, I mean, are significantly predictive of more groups in the future. So, and that's even when you string them together. So that, you know, like in Myanmar, I mean, that, you know, in 1989, let's say they were fighting 3 groups. Over the next 25 years, you know, they achieved 12 military victories. And when they exit the time series, they're fighting 3 times as many groups as when they started. But they eliminated 12 groups. But you know, even when that record of failure and the really the successful record of implementing political settlements, you know, it's still a tough thing to do. You know, settlements are still rare, right? So why is that? Well, you got a terrible record here for national military-centric policies, and you've got a really good record for peace agreements. But it's still hard to reach them. And that's because it's such a hard pill for people to swallow around the justice issues of giving amnesty to what people see as criminals. Release, the biggest one is releasing from prison. You know, that's a real, so many negotiations have failed because of this issue of releasing terrorists and you know, criminals from prison. That's really tough thing to accomplish. I mean, not just at an emotional level, but it's institutionally, it's a tough thing to accomplish, to get the justice institutions to actually do that. It's difficult, but so that's, I mean, that's difficult even in a civil war context. So I mean, think about with a, you know, with, you see how the problem's magnified here so much more. I mean, the thought of giving amnesty, you know, to.
I would suggest the categories that we have right now in terms of belligerent groups, civil war, do not fit the situation. We're gonna have to come up with new frameworks because they're both understood as criminal groups. They're sometimes belligerent forces. They control the territory. They don't control the territory. The categories that we have right now in terms of the international system don't really fit what we're experiencing, I think, in Central America, Colombia, Mexico, within the cartel framework and the gang framework. I think we're gonna have to come up with new approaches to this and some very new ideas.
Now let's go here and then you, John.
I was going to add, in relation to what you have just said, what about if you think about the result of the Colombian peace agreements where the FARC is not only a guerrilla group, but it's also a criminal organization. So that would be like a very inspiring example of thinking of bringing models of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, thinking about our criminal groups that we are having in Latin America. So maybe it's time to us academics to start to nurturing this narrative of the need of bringing these models to criminal violence.
I think the Colombian experience has a number of similarities with the Central American problems in terms of reintegration, in terms of the reintegration to these non-state violent actors to society. Because as in Colombia, for different reasons and totally different contexts, it's now pretty evident that you cannot afford to think of in a sustainable peace process without taking that into consideration. And you know, I agree. Academia has to kind of, you know, renew the thinking about this because there's a lot of nuances. But what's true is that it's not as in a war. I mean, these actors are part of society, are part of the fabric. They're not alien to the daily functioning of society. And that's when I think in the case of Colombia, if you go to the, the places in which the FARC had a stronghold or a footprint in southern the Pacific states departments, FARC was part of daily life. They were an authority. They had their own justice system even, right? Their own economy. You know, coca transformation is the only economy in a lot of these towns and places. So how do you integrate that to the entire fabric of society, right? It hurts. It hurts.
So, you mentioned that the gang, you said that the disease is hopelessness?
I said that.
Yeah. So I have two questions. You have hope. And how do you restore hope?
The second one?
How do you restore hope in the young people? And you have hope is the first one. What's your hope? And how do you restore hope in the young people?
Let me say this. I don't have any hope in the ruling elites. Anyone whatsoever. Any hope whatsoever. Whether that's the left, the right, Jimmy Morales, Donald Trump, or Nayib Bukele. Their purpose, their achievements are different. Or the things they want to achieve is power. It's all into power. I do find hope in community, you know. And the only reason for that is because I've been in Central American communities, mainly here in the United States. And, you know, the resilience they have, which has been given to them by pain, mostly by pain, you know. I mean, it's almost it's a survival mode, you know, and in their way to survive, they have learned to enhance the community. You know, for a migrant, for instance, the only way to survive is within a community. You know, if you come from, and that's what the gang is at the end of the day, right? You know, if you come from El Salvador, you don't know a word of English. You come to a broken home in New Jersey. You go to a school in which, you know, your peers will bully you because you don't speak good English or you don't speak English at all. You try to find the community. And the community that these kids have found is the gang. So yeah, in that regard, it's not a disease. This has been a survival entity. And but then, where I have found hope is in places in which that sense of community has been taken by power, by political power, by the state, and has been transformed in other forms of opportunity. And it has given hope. Yes, I mean, I've seen that. I've seen that in the forms of social work or even even in the families or parents of children that have avoid extreme forms of pain. You know, like in a father that brought his girl to the United States and found that, yeah, things aren't perfect, threats, menaces are there, but she's not going to be raped at the corner of the street. So, yeah, I think that's where the answer lies, you know, in the community.
Gracias.
De nada. Estamos, ¿no?
Anyone else?